Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into something absolutely fascinating and honestly, incredibly timely. We're going to unpack a deeply insightful academic critique by Jerome Reed. It's called Decolonizing Curriculum and Assessment in Peel District School Board Secondary Classrooms. Now look, education reform is a huge conversation right now, but Reed's paper? It asks us to look way past the surface-level changes we usually see. He's literally challenging us to question the entire foundation of how we measure what a student knows. So let's get right into it.
So, can a standardized test actually be colonized? I know, it's a bit of a jarring question, isn't it? Because normally when we think about modernizing or, decolonizing education, we kind of just assume it means adding indigenous books to a reading list or making sure we talk about diverse histories in class. But Reed's core premise hits on something much deeper. He argues that simply swapping out the content of what we teach doesn't actually mean much if the way we test that knowledge is still rooted in a completely colonial system. Think about it. If the ultimate measure of a student's success is still a traditional, timed, written exam, have we really decolonized anything at all?
Section 1. Beyond just adding content.
Before we get lost in the heavy theory, it is absolutely crucial to understand who is actually making this argument. Jerome Reed kicks off his paper by explicitly outlining his positionality, and I love this because it grounds a very academic discussion in real lived human experience. He is a black male educator and guidance counselor, and he has over a decade of service in Ontario's Peel District School Board, so he knows the system inside and out. He openly acknowledges that he has relative job security and a strong institutional platform. Plus, he's a father of mixed Indigenous and Black children, doing his work on the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. The point here is, he isn't lobbing critiques from the outside. He is inside the machine every single day. He recognizes that as a settler himself, even though he experiences his own marginalization as a black man, he has a responsibility to actively confront how his own workplace maintains its power.
And that brings us to a really foundational concept Reed borrows from scholars Eve Tuck and K. Wayne Yang, settler moves to innocence. It's a brilliant term, and it perfectly captures exactly what Reed is warning us about. This is what happens when institutions use all the right progressive buzzwords, or maybe roll out some surface-level equity reforms that make everyone feel, well, innocent and good about themselves. But they completely avoid making any actual, material changes to who holds the power, land return, or indigenous sovereignty. Reed argues that throwing some indigenous content into a Eurocentric curriculum, but keeping the exact same testing methods, that's a textbook move to innocence. It lets schools look incredibly progressive without actually giving up any of their evaluative power.
Section 2. What is cognitive imperialism?
To break this down further, Reed leans on the work of scholar Marie Baptiste, specifically her concept of cognitive imperialism. This is the subtle, everyday process where Eurocentric schooling frames Western ways of knowing as just the default, like it's totally neutral, objective, and universal. And meanwhile, indigenous knowledge gets treated as something extra, supplemental, super local, or just a bit of cultural flavor. So the kicker is, when a school forces a student to prove they understand an indigenous concept, but they have to do it strictly through a standard 5-paragraph written English essay, that school is enforcing cognitive imperialism. They're essentially saying, hey, your knowledge is fine, but it only counts if you package it up in our Western format.
So how do we actually fix this? Well, Reed pulls together the teachings of several prominent scholars to build a 4-step framework for genuinely decolonizing curriculum. First up, following Baptiste, we have to actually center indigenous knowledges, not just tack them on at the end of the year. Second, drawing from Joe Crona, we desperately need to rethink the word rigor. Rigor doesn't just mean sitting in absolute silence taking a standardized written test, it can be deeply relational and holistic. Third, via Leanne Batasamaki-Simpson, learning has to be inextricably linked to the land and territory. And finally, leaning on Tuck and Yang again, we have to stop confusing mere inclusion with actual structural decolonization. They are not the same thing.
Section 3. Indigenous Approaches to Assessment.
Okay, let's look at the stark difference here. On one side, you've got traditional Eurocentric assessment. We all know it. It's almost entirely written, strictly time-limited, highly individualistic, totally English-dominant, and standardized across thousands of students. But on the flip side, indigenous pedagogies approach evaluation in a completely different universe. It is deeply relational, it's an ongoing process, not just a one-time high-stakes event. It focuses on a student's strengths, and it's completely embedded in the community and the land itself. Just imagine the profound difference between a student demonstrating their understanding of a local ecosystem by actually guiding an elder on the land versus being shoved into a sterile, quiet room to fill in bubbles on a Scantron sheet. We're talking about two completely different paradigms of what it means to be smart.
Section 4. The Standardized Testing Conflict.
Now, it's not all doom and gloom. Reed actually highlights that on a local level, the Peel District School Board is trying to make some really positive moves. They're out there taking tangible steps to implement holistic learning. They're engaging in collaborative inquiry with Indigenous partners, and they're even starting to let students demonstrate what they've learned through performance-based community tasks. That is a massive step forward when it comes to diversifying how students can show what they know and shifting authority away from just the teacher.
But right as that's happening locally, here comes the friction. The Ontario provincial government has proposed a massive, sweeping mandate. This proposed legislation would essentially require all grade 9 through 12 courses to have mandatory written final exams on an official, designated exam day, complete with totally uniform weighting for attendance and participation. So right as local schools are trying to open things up and be flexible, this is a huge top-down push for rigid standardization.
And this is where Reed points out a glaring, almost painful contradiction. I really think this quote hits the nail on the head. He writes, "If, after a semester of inquiry projects, oral presentations, land-based activities, the province's only authoritative assessment of student achievement is a mandatory written exam, then the province is saying that the other types of learning are not as important." Impartially speaking, Reed's critique is that enforcing this universal written exam completely undercuts any decolonial, innovative teaching happening in the classroom. It immediately just slaps the colonial assessment right back into the center as the only thing that genuinely counts.
Section 5. The Uncomfortable Institutional Truth.
So let's get brutally honest for a second and break down how institutions actually operate. Using a framework from scholars Gaudry and Lorenz, look at this spread. Most schools sit very comfortably right there in the inclusion column. They're adding new content, sure, but Eurocentric norms stay totally intact, and there is zero redistribution of power. Now, some places might level up to reconciliation. They're building relationships, they're raising awareness, but notice something? The traditional grading systems remain exactly the same. Very, very few institutions ever make it to actual decolonization, because that requires land return, it requires honoring treaty obligations, and crucially, handing over actual, real control of the curriculum to Indigenous communities. Reed uses this to hold a mirror up to the education system. Most of what we proudly call decolonization today, it's really just inclusion or reconciliation at best.
Because of this reality, Reed argues that there are very strict limits to what you can achieve just by transforming a single classroom. As an educator, you can overhaul your syllabus, you can diversify your assignments all year long, but representation without sovereignty redistributes absolutely zero power. When it's all said and done, if the institution still holds the keys to the final evaluation logic and gets to dictate what counts as a valid learning outcome, the system itself hasn't budged an inch. Adopting a single assignment to be a bit more inclusive is definitely a good thing, but Reed makes it crystal clear that is not the same thing as actively refusing a colonial system.
Which leads us to a seriously provocative question to end on. Reed challenges educators, and really all of us with this. When commitments go beyond the limits of acceptable reform, what are you willing to risk, sacrifice, or disrupt? It's such a powerful summation of his entire argument. If true, systemic decolonization literally requires giving up institutional power and control over assessment. Are we actually willing to do it? Or are we just going to keep using progressive buzzwords while keeping the standardized tests exactly the same? It's a lot to chew on. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I really hope this deep dive into Joel Reed's work leaves you questioning the future of how we measure learning. Catch you next time.